Can you all, yeah, you can all hear me. I'm KT McFarland. I'm the Fox News National Security Analyst, and we are here to discuss the crisis and chaos in Europe. If you're here for something else, you're welcome to stay, but you're not going to hear what you think you're going to hear. We also, I think, have some visiting members of the European Parliament here. I don't know if they've arrived. Oh, there she is, Janice.
The rest are on their way.
The French are going to be a little late. Okay, so we're here to have some fun. I'm KT McFarland, as I said. I'm the Fox News National Security Analyst. But before that, a long time before that, I worked in government. I was in the Nixon, Ford, and Reagan administrations. I was an aide to Henry Kissinger, and finished my government time in the middle 1980s as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration. And then I did what no women ever do anymore, which is I quit. I got married, moved to New York, did the housewife mom thing for about 15 years, and then, after September 11th, was inspired by my very rebellious then 12, 13-year-old daughter to get back to work, Mom. And so I have gotten back into public life and now work at Fox News. One of the key issues of the day, and I think the one that we are going to be focused on increasingly in the next 12 months, is Europe and the chaos in Europe that was not predicted 3 or 4 years ago. So here to discuss are three very carefully chosen experts. Dr. Niall Gardner, he's the director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. In the middle is Ben Collins. He's a former Green Beret, spent 5 years in Afghanistan, and he's a frequent defense and national security analyst on Fox News and other places. And finally, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He's the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and a former naval officer. And you see them all on Fox News. And I just to make things perfectly clear, how many of you watch Fox News? Oh, this is a very well-informed audience, guys, so you got to up your game. Before we get into the crisis in Europe today, I'm going to, at the risk of being really boring, give you a little history lesson. Let me start by asking, anybody watch Downton Abbey? Fairly well-informed audience. Okay, go back to the beginning of Downton Abbey and 100 years ago. 100 years ago, Britain tore itself apart and Europe tore itself apart in World War I. It was a long and bitter, and many people feel the most useless war in history. At the end of it, the leadership, a whole generation was lost. They were slaughtered in the fighting fields of Central Europe. After that, Europe hadn't recovered, and it went into a recession and ultimately a deep depression, economic depression, where there was massive unemployment, massive inflation, and massive political instability throughout Europe. And then the rise of Hitler. In the late 1930s, Hitler decided he was going to reclaim the great German Empire, and World War II happened. So a lot of the same fighting fields of World War I were battles again in World War II. Again, massive destruction, particularly in cities and in countrysides, but this time, Britain, with the bombing of Britain. At the end of World War II, the European countries looked at each other and said, we're exhausted. We have just spent the last 60 years at war with each other that nobody won, and we've had economic dislocation. How are we going to prevent this from ever happening again? We had said World War I, when we started out, was the war to end all wars, and it seems to have been the war that started all wars. So the European nations, including Britain, got together and they did a couple of things. They formed a security alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the NATO alliance, and then we were all going to be in the same club. We were not going to fight each other, and we were going to have a strong defense against a potential rise of a Soviet Union. The second thing they did was form an economic club and a political club. And it was first called the Common Market. It later became the European Union. And the goal of that was to say, we're going to take down our borders. We're not going to fight each other anymore, so we don't need much of a military. And we're going to take down our borders. We're going to travel freely from one end of the European Union to the other. Commerce will flow freely. Trade will flow freely. Currencies will have a common currency. And we will all be working together with the idea that maybe ultimately we will be like the United States of America, the United States of Europe. And that worked out just great. The fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s led even more credence to that, and it encouraged the European countries, which had built very big welfare states, to build even bigger welfare states and to reduce their militaries. And 5 years ago, if you had asked any national security expert, any European expert, any economic expert, they would have said, Europe is the blueprint. They know how to do it. There is peace and prosperity in Europe. America should follow suit. Increase the welfare state, reduce defenses. I mean, how many of us have heard that argument, right? And then, about 18 months ago, it started collapsing. Economically, politically, militarily. So the three gentlemen here are going to explain different aspects of it, and then we'd like to have a little bit of conversation between us, and we'd also like to have a big conversation with you. So if you have any questions, think about it. We will also call on a member of the European Parliament to give us, who's come from Europe, to talk about what's really happening on the ground. So let me start with you, Dr. Niall Gardner. What's the political situation in Europe?
Thanks very much, Katie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. The political situation in Europe, it's extremely dire. I mean, I would describe the European Union in many respects as a complete basket case today. And this is why millions of British people want to leave the European Union. And on June 23rd, the British people will vote in a referendum for the first time in over 40 years to decide their future in Europe. And with very good reason. Many in Britain view the European Union as a Titanic, and the referendum offers a lifeboat for the British people to jump on board. And as my former boss, Margaret Thatcher, used to say, the European project, the idea of creating a European superstate, is the greatest folly of the modern era. And if you think the Obama presidency is bad, well, you know, the European Union, the Brussels mindset, the sort of European project, is the Obama presidency, you know, writ large 10 times over. It worships at the trough of big government, big spending, soaring taxes, vast welfare states, uncontrolled, unfunded welfare and entitlement systems. The European Union is really a sort of socialist mecca in a sense, and it is crumbling. And with very good reason, not only in Britain, but across Europe. Millions upon millions of Europeans want to get out of the European Union. And for the British people, this is a fight for sovereignty and self-determination. It's a fight to be, once again, a truly free sovereign nation. It's also about controlling Britain's borders, deciding who comes into the country. And it's also about saving money. And the European Union, which is, in my view, an extremely dysfunctional, badly run entity, fundamentally anti-democratic in the way it's run, and also, you know, spends money like water, really. And as Margaret Thatcher used to say, you know, the problem with socialist governments is that eventually they run out of other people's money to spend. And that's what's happening in Europe, really. It's the European Union, in essence, is run by a group of largely socialist left-wing bureaucrats, or some conservatives who claim to be conservatives but are not real conservatives at all. And it is about the suppression of national sovereignty and self-determination. It's also, I believe, the European Union, as it stands today, a tremendous threat to national security as well, because of the open borders policy within the Schengen countries. And as we've seen with the recent Paris attacks, ISIS, Islamist terrorists across Europe, are exploiting this open borders policy. And I do think it's fundamentally important for Britain to be able to control its own borders, decide who comes in, and leaving the European Union really is the best way to advance British security. Now, Angela Merkel has a very different idea. She's the biggest supporter of the European project in Europe. She's invited in over 1 million refugees or economic migrants into Germany. Those migrants would eventually have the right to move across the European Union. In my view, this is a policy of cultural suicide that Angela Merkel is advancing. And with very good reason, leaders across Europe are standing up to Merkel and saying no to German domination of Europe. And many European leaders are saying, you know, we wish to decide our own country's future and protect our own borders. And Angela Merkel's open invitation to millions upon millions of refugees, largely economic migrants, I might say, heavily infiltrated by ISIS, and being used by an array of Islamist terrorist organizations. This is an extremely dangerous policy that is being implemented, and it must be strongly resisted in the United States and across Europe. I would just conclude by saying that, you know, President Obama has been lecturing the British people about how they should be voting in their referendum on June 23rd. President Obama...
It's your turn now.
President Obama doesn't even like Britain. In fact, he's probably the most anti-British president of modern times. The same goes for Hillary Clinton as well, another big supporter of the European project. In fact, it's none of President Obama's business or Hillary Clinton's business to tell the British people it's none of their business to tell the British people how they should be voting. The British people will decide their own future. And I think that on June 23rd, I believe that the British people will send an emphatic message in favor of sovereignty, freedom, and self-determination. Those are the very, very values that the American people also stand for as well. And I believe that the American people should embrace Brexit when it occurs and welcome back once again a truly free and sovereign great British nation on the world stage.
I'm going to tell us how you really think, right? I'm going to be traffic cop here. There are a couple of seats scattered here and there. Please take them. If there are any young and able-bodied who can sit down and then manage to get up after they sit down, you can sit along front here. And Justin, if you can make sure that the door, anybody who wants to come in can maybe leave the door open for a little while so we don't have the back and forth clink clank. This is the open door policy. Anyone can come in. But don't you expect anything free when you get here. Okay, Ben, I want to turn to you and talk to us about the security threat, not just the internal security threat, but, you know, Vladimir Putin and the Russian bear is chomping at the border.
So, thank you, KT. So, I would start by saying just a warning that knowing Obama and the Democrats, they're going to find some way to vote in your Brexit election. So keep an eye on it because we've seen it before. Watch the graveyards. So Clausewitz is a very famous military philosopher and strategist, and he said that war is politics by another means. And if you take that into consideration and you start watching what Vladimir Putin has been doing in Russia over the last several years, it starts to make sense. So his military decisions are really based in a political and economic reality that he has. I think that what we have lost in the last decade or so, at least in the U.S., has been two things that I think are very important for a country's national security policy or foreign policy. And that's clarity, one, and two, it's predictability. If we don't know what we're going to be doing the next day, I guarantee you our allies and our enemies don't know what we're going to be doing either. In a vacuum like that, you start to lose something that has taken years for us to build, and that's the ability to conduct deterrence, right? And deterrence is when, you know, the enemy decides that they are not going to do something because they know exactly what it is that you're going to do. And Obama has essentially just written that off, and that's going to take decades, I believe, for us to get back. Secondly, by taking us away from the international, from leading in a global way, the enemies, certainly our enemies, started to see that there was no plan or no strategy that he was going to follow, so they started to really test the waters. And so they started seeing things like the shipping lanes in Southeast Asia. They started seeing things like the red line in Syria in terms of chemical weapons, and President Obama still did nothing. And so one person who was watching that very closely was Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, just for some context, when Obama was essentially enrolling in his high school, Vladimir Putin was enrolling in the KGB. When Obama was organizing communities in Chicago, Vladimir Putin was working with the East German Stasi. So very different mindsets here. Vladimir Putin was born in St. Petersburg. However, if you need any more clarity as to his mindset, in every interview, he still refers to it as Leningrad. So this is a man that's driven right now essentially, in he's got two goals. One, he wants to bring back the great Soviet Union of the old. He wants to incorporate the old Baltic states back under Russia control. And there's also an economic play as well. So Russia is a country that's entirely dependent, their economy, on fossil fuels. So we've seen the price of oil crash, the ruble's crashed, inflation in Russia has gone up tremendously. The Russian people are hurting. And the one lever that Russia has always really been able to have in terms of Europe, and this is where it starts getting tied in, is natural gas. So they've always been able to use natural gas as a lever to turn on and turn off, since they provide about 25% of the natural gas to Europe. So when you take that into those things into context, you know, the one thing that that Vladimir Putin that stands in his way is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And just in January, in his latest national security paper, Vladimir Putin declared that NATO was essentially the most essential national security threat to Russia. And his actions have essentially followed suit in that. If you look at what he, you know, in terms of NATO countries, we were trying to get Georgia and the Ukraine into NATO, and we were proposing membership in 2008. And Germany essentially fought against that, Germany and France, because they didn't want to anger Putin, and because Putin essentially could turn on and turn off the natural gas. And then we saw essentially the invasion of the Ukraine in 2009, I believe, 2008, 2009. And since then, we have seen him move further, annexation of Crimea, and certainly the civil war that he's kicked off in the Ukraine. From there, he's essentially he's taken advantage of the chaos that's existed in the Middle East, and we've seen the work that he's doing with Syria. The long-term, you know, and if you look certainly on the map, you have to consider the geography of this region, because as he wants to move into the Baltic states, he now has a significant presence in Syria. He stood up an air base there, which gives him the ability to conduct flights over a NATO country, one of the NATO countries, Turkey. So Turkey is key here. In the last couple of months, he's moved a number of troops into Armenia. So unfortunately for Turkey, they have essentially found themselves once again encircled. So he has troops in Syria, he has troops in Armenia. And that's a very scary thing, because Turkey is a NATO country. And I think about a couple months ago when Turkey shot down that plane, everybody was petrified and thinking, is this it? Is this going to be the one? Are we going to have Article 5 kicked off under NATO, and what's going to happen? What you can't escape here, and it's my belief that I think a lot of the actions, besides the ideological and the return to Great Mother Russia, it revolves around economics and gas. So the largest gas field that's in the world is in the Persian Gulf, and Qatar owns most of it. And so before the Syrian war really kicked off, there were two pipelines that were being proposed. And one was going to go essentially from Qatar through mostly the Sunni-controlled states into Turkey, and then from Turkey into Europe. The second one was going to essentially, because Iran owns a little piece of it, they were going to run it, Iran through Syria. So for Putin, the worst thing that could happen, I think, in his mind as an economic strategic occurrence would be if Europe was able to start getting gas through Turkey through this pipeline, then essentially that number one lever that I spoke about would be able to be mitigated. So to me, I think that explains a lot of his actions from an economic perspective, being able to get into Syria and start controlling that and ensuring that if one does get built, it gets built under his eye. Russia and Putin have followed a game plan, and that is essentially where they use the image of there are Russian citizens in the Ukraine that are fighting for independence, and Russia has to come to their salvation. And I think right now the biggest fear that we certainly have, and if you look at the dynamics of our own political system right now, so we've got a little bit more time left with Obama. We really don't know what's going to happen in the presidential election. So my biggest fear is that Putin is probably staring at this thing going, look, if, whether it's Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, who knows, but the reality is it becomes another level of unpredictability. And if anything is predictable right now, we know that Obama will not do anything. So if I'm Putin, I would be staring at some of these Baltic states. I would essentially use the flag of their asking for help, move in with tanks and troops, and then essentially we would find out once and for all, and I think this is what Putin is driving, is NATO an organization with teeth or without teeth? And unfortunately, Europe is going through the crisis that they're going through, not just politically, but economically. We are going through our own economic problems. We have the history recently of Iraq and Afghanistan fresh in our mind and the losses, and the political circus, I think, that's going on right now. So the question becomes, should one of these states fall and invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter, would we indeed act? And unfortunately right now, I think the answer in my mind is we would not. And I think that has the ability to just completely erode and destabilize NATO, which would just further increase the security concerns in the European Union.
Great, thank you very much. There are a lot of people standing in the back. If you'd like to, you're more than welcome to come sit around here on the floor. And if you have trouble getting back up, I'm sure somebody will help you back up. I'd like to now turn to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who's been an outspoken analyst on the whole threat of Islamic Jihad, but the rise of Islamism.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you, KT, and I want to thank CPAC for inviting me and allowing us to have our voice and perspective heard. I want to do a couple things, quick, just tell you what my lens is for this, but the two main things is look at why this happened, especially in the last year, and second, what does this mean for Europe as far as the mass immigration in the past year. First of all, my lens, not only as an American, but as an American Muslim and an American of Syrian origin. My parents escaped Syria in mid-60s as political refugees, escaping the Ba'athist regime that basically is the same as the Assad regime. The Assads took over in 1970. And ultimately, the milieu, as much as the revolution started in 2011, there are more expatriates. Before the revolution, there were more expatriate Syrians outside Syria than there were inside Syria because of the mass exodus and brain drain from Syria over decades and generations. Since 9/11, as KT mentioned, I've been dedicated to looking at Muslim reform, countering the main threat, which is Islamism, political Islam, and all of its manifestations. We were telling Congress in 2011 that if you didn't do anything, not militarily, but at least with no-fly zones, with trying to pick some sides if possible in Syria, that ultimately would become a magnet for jihadists, and this was long before ISIS. And sure enough, ISIS then developed in Syria. But if we look at what's happening, there is a clash of civilizations that we see. And in our work at the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, we have developed what's called a Muslim Reform Movement, and that reform movement has a declaration that we think can be used to try to vet not only domestic Muslims that are here and their organizations, but immigrants, refugees, to see are they willing to adapt into Western society, or are they going to come in as Trojan horses to spread political Islam and Islamic State ideology. But first, if you look at Syria, let's just look at the context in the last year. Before the mass immigration in the spring of 2015 that happened, there were almost 1 million in Turkey, there were 1 million in Lebanon, there were 500,000 in Jordan, there were millions in the countries around that have already been refugees from Syria since 2011. Not to mention the non-displaced, the displaced Syrians within Syria during the revolution. So what happened in early 2015? Early 2015, my family can tell you, the ones in Aleppo and in Damascus who've been dodging barrel bombs and chemical weapons, in the spring of 2015, the Assad regime handed out millions of passports. It was almost a warning saying that if you don't get out of here, they wanted to change the demographics in Syria and cause a mass exodus. And when that mass exodus was so quick and so fast, Turkey couldn't absorb them, Jordan couldn't absorb them, they went naturally right into Europe. And sure enough, the plan was set in stone. With Russia already, it looks in retrospect, it's obvious. September 30th, Russia starts bombing operations. Russia had already put its chips in that it was going to maintain Assad in power. And sure enough, their bombing operation was not against ISIS. It was against the rebellion to make sure that Assad stays in power. They've sort of left ISIS alone with sort of, little nicks here and there. But their main operation is to stop the rebellion and keep Assad in power. 60–70% of Syrian population are Sunni. So the best thing that Assad can do, if he can't kill all the Sunnis, is to ship them out and cause a demographic change in Syria. And that's what led to the European crisis of refugees, was handing out 5 million passports, telling as many as possible to get out of Syria, and they went towards Europe. And we can talk about why didn't they go to Saudi Arabia, why didn't they go elsewhere. The bottom line is they went to Europe. So what's happening in Europe, and what problems do these refugees bring with them to Europe? I will tell you first, I want to add one thing about the refugees and ISIS. Yes, they are infiltrated. Yes, it is a massive security threat because we're not vetting. Obviously, background checks mean nothing when you're talking about a government which is the enemy of the West, which is Assad and Russia. So background checks don't mean anything. We're not vetting for jihadism. ISIS wants to divide the world into Dar al-Islam, which is the land of Islam, and the land of war, Dar al-Harb. So these Muslims are escaping not only Assad but ISIS, but if they can infiltrate them, they can allow the land of war then to become chaotic and withdraw even more so that they can take over Syria. Tablet magazine reported a few weeks ago, and I think it's important that you understand this, not only are the refugees infiltrated by ISIS, but they're infiltrated by Assadists, Mukhabarat, which is the intelligence services of Syria, Russian operatives, Iranian operatives, Hezbollah. So to think that it's just ISIS that are infiltrating, they want to sow chaos in Europe, infiltrate the expatriate Syrian population will tell you the Syrian intelligence has been infiltrating our communities in America and in the West since the 60s. This is nothing new, and it's not going to stop in a revolution when the Assad regime is fighting for its survival in order to maintain its propaganda and strength. Lastly, in Europe, the crisis with radical Islam or political Islam did not start with this immigration crisis. It started post 9/11 and even before. You saw the Danish cartoon crisis, you saw 7/7, many attacks of radical Islamist groups in order to withdraw the will of Europe to influence the Middle East, especially post-Arab awakening with its ideas of freedom. There's been an equal and opposite reaction, which is the Pegida movement, the European nationalist movement, if you will. And, as a Muslim, I will tell you that we should bear some, as much as that has, supranationalist undertones, fascist undertones to some of what's being propagated in the Pegida movement. The bottom line is that the silence from the Muslim community as being part of the solution to radical Islam, I think, is driving some of that alienation of European identity from feeling that Muslims are part of that solution. And I think if we speak up more in a nationalistic way that we want to fight against political Islam, it will resolve some of that. And Prime Minister Cameron recently, a few weeks ago, laid out a direct connection between the Muslim Brotherhood and radical Islamic groups. And in Europe, in England, Muslim Brotherhood operates openly. In the United States, they're more covert because we don't have open religious parties in the U.S. So in Europe, they're much more open. And Prime Minister Cameron, to his courage, laid out a report that delineated a direct connection between nonviolent Islamist organizations and radical Islamist groups like ISIS and Hamas, etc. So that connection, as Europe makes that, will make it much more safe for them to begin to vet the radicals in their community. And I think lastly, if you look at the Cologne incidents, the mass rapes of women and violence against women that we saw in January, in January, a few months ago, when that happened, it took 5 to 10 days before anybody reported on it, which is just bizarre. And then when they reported on it, some of the solution was to have European rallies that women were protected. They were turning Europe into Saudi Arabia because they were worried that the hormonal refugees would not be able to tolerate it. So rather than put them in their place with the rule of law, Europe surrenders and starts to separate men and women because they want to protect them. And they didn't even want to talk about it because of political correctness, etc. My final comment to you is that this struggle, first of all, is happening because the millions that came in pushed. When you have mass immigration, clash of civilizational ideas ends up causing a sonic boom of conflict of ideology, which is what's happening. if Europe doesn't deal with the rule of law and maintain and figure out what its identity is, which my colleagues have talked about, this is only going to get worse and radicalize those communities. Last is we have to be smart about it and not confuse Muslim identity, which many of whom came to Europe because, like my family, they wanted to be free, with Islamist identity, which is a political movement that is antithetical to Western ideas. We have to do all that as we look at security in the West and security in Europe, and I think we have to target root causes. A no-fly zone in Syria, and all of a sudden where nobody was supporting us when we were calling for that in 2012, everybody's saying, oh, we should have done that because the refugees then wouldn't have left Syria. They would have had safe places in Syria to stay rather than leave because of the bombing that they were having.
Okay, well, I think you've all done a very good job of in-depth introduction of the problem. I think now, to give a lot of time for questions, I'd like to throw out the first question to Janice Atkinson, who's a member of the European Parliament from Britain. She's here in the front row. If you could just ask a question, but also tell us what's going on in Europe, and then we're going to turn to the rest of the audience for questions. So Janice, let me hand you my mic, if I can. And can you tell us about what's the view from Europe?
Okay, it's been really heartening coming here to CPAC because you guys really get the nation state. You get your sovereignty. Month after month, I have to go to Strasbourg. I have no power. I'm a member of the European Parliament, but all I can do is slightly amend and tweak legislation. I tweak a word here and there because the laws come down from the unelected Commission. Now, we've got a threat. We're under the threat of the clash of civilizations, and I'm glad that you're speaking about this. This is really frightening at the moment, but we're not just seeing the collapse of Europe if Britain leaves, and I totally back Brexit, and I've met so many of you here today that actually, or over the past few days, that back Brexit. Europe is collapsing anyway, and we have got the rise of the far right, which is really unfortunate. And then we got the patriot parties, like the Front National in France, we've got UKIP in the UK, we have the PVV, which is headed up by Geert Wilders. These are all patriotic parties. Now, when I sit in the European Parliament, we're told we're racist, we're xenophobes. You know, we're anti-immigration. We're not anti-immigration. I'm not anti-immigration. I want the brightest and best from around the world, but I also want to control my borders. And we are stopped from doing that. I mean, my hero, Margaret Thatcher, your employer, everything that Niall said here today, we totally agree with. Cameron is appeasing. Cameron is as an Obama, in my opinion. I stood for him in 2010 in a key target seat because I wanted to take my country back. Now, what we see in the European Parliament is €3 billion have been sent to Turkey. Now, when I went to the Conference of Presidents last week representing my group, Cameron was supposed to come into that meeting and discuss with all the leaders of the European parties within Europe about Brexit. He refused to meet me. He refused to meet Nigel Farage. He refused to meet the Greens, and he refused to meet the left. There's a very cosy cartel that happens over there, and we're totally against that. So we have got the rise of the nationalist parties, but we're patriots. You know, we represent 36 to 40% of the people across Europe, and we're rising. And with your help, you know, we can be great again. We want to trade with you. TTIP is the wrong thing to do. We do not want to go down the road of TTIP. And this is a right and left issue. But people like Angela Merkel is pushing this through. And then we go to Angela Merkel. You know, it's 2 million that she's actually welcomed in now. And this is because she's appeasing her past, because they have the guilt of what happened in Germany. And the rest of us are going to pay the price of that, because as soon as she gives them passports in 4 years' time, they can come across the border. She's not checking them. And then I leave you, I could spend hours on this. But as a female in the European Parliament, I tried to put those Cologne sex attacks on the agenda. I was refused. I was told, no, you can't discuss it. We're not discussing it. It's xenophobic. It's racist. But the left, actually, and when we talk about the left, we talk about Angela Merkel's party. And they're supposed to sit on the centre-right of conservatism. They're not. They refused to have that on the agenda. They wanted to talk about the refugees, the women, the children. I'm happy to talk about that. But I also wanted those Cologne sex attacks. And the most disgraceful thing that happened in my country, it took social media to put this on the agenda. And the BBC, the British broadcasting company, of which I contribute to through my taxes, spent 9 seconds on that, and that's disgraceful. And that's why we got to leave, and I'm so glad that you're all supporting Brexit. Cheer!
I wouldn't want to take you on. Okay, Hans, do you want to ask a question? And if you could speak up, and then I'll repeat it if people can't hear it.
Okay. I'm really struck by the fact that Putin has used exactly the same excuse that Adolf Hitler used of having moved in to protect Russian-speaking minorities when they have seized and land gone into Georgia, Ukraine, and elsewhere. And while you haven't talked about it, on the other side of the world, we have the Chinese trying to push us out of the Pacific, seemingly following the Japanese model of the Greater East Asia prosperity sphere. Am I wrong to misread this as seeming like it's eerily 1935 and we are facing the same kind of threats that were faced then, and we may get into a major conflict in two parts of the world complicated by Islamic jihad?
Anybody want to take that? Niall, why don't you take it on?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, actually. And I think you're right. I mean, it is a bit like the 1930s on the European front, on the Middle Eastern front. And let's be under no illusions with regard to just how dangerous Vladimir Putin is. And the Russians are even flying bombers off the coasts of Britain and other European countries, testing the NATO alliance. And as the NATO Supreme Commander declared earlier this week, the Russian intervention in Syria is weaponizing refugees flooding into Europe. And so Putin is a big part of the problem in terms of this refugee migrant issue. And the Russian reset strategy, which has been implemented by the Obama administration, is nothing less than a policy of appeasement towards Moscow. And the architect of that policy, of course, is Hillary Clinton. I mean, this is her flagship so-called foreign policy achievement as Secretary of State. And it is an extremely dangerous policy. And it is similar, in my view, to the Obama administration's appeasement of the Iranian regime as well. And the Iran nuclear deal is catastrophic for the United States and its allies.
All right, thank you. All right, there are an awful lot of people standing out in the hallway. If you could just open these doors so people have an opportunity, if not to get in the room, at least to listen.
Keith,
Let me go over there to the back. Stand up.
I travel extensively to Europe, specifically Berlin and London. I just returned from London a couple days ago. What I heard about the Angela Merkel thing was right on. In fact, most of the people, business people that I talked to there, repeated the same thing. She is an East German. A lot of people don't know that. And she carries a lot of guilt with respect to refugees and what happened in World War II. Specifically to London, there, with respect to this referendum, one of the issues that the side that's favoring that they stay in the EU is the fact that it's going to disintegrate a lot of this trade that, with respect to London. A lot of the business people are afraid that there's some uncertainty there with respect to if they pull out of that referendum.
Okay.
Or pull out of the EU, that there's going to be an issue there.
Anybody want to take on what happens if the Brits vote in favor of leaving the European Union? Does the all of European Union collapse? Anybody want to take that on? Okay, Niall, it's yours. Actually, what we would have had, we had invited the Lord Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, to come to CPAC at Ben Collins' suggestion, and he was really tempted to come, but he's in a political fight for his life, so he couldn't make it. So maybe we'll invite him for next year. Okay.
Yes, and again, really excellent question. What's going to happen to the European Union? Well, in my view, Brexit is not only good for Britain, it's good for Europe as well. Why? Because I think it is going to be the beginning of the end of the European project. And let's separate the European project from individual European nation states. And I believe the idea of having this grand supranational entity lording it over the whole of Europe is not in the interest of anyone inside Europe, except perhaps in the interest of a figure like Angela Merkel, who you mentioned earlier. And in conjunction with the decline of the European project, you're going to see the decline of German power in Europe as well. And we're already seeing the beginning of that. And I think the refugee crisis is a sure sign that German power is in decline. After all, Angela Merkel tried to force refugee quotas on the rest of Europe. And many European countries said, no, we are going to decide how many refugees we take in, if at all. For example, the Poles and the Hungarians, the Czechs, the Slovenians across Europe have stood up to Germany. And this is why the Germans are fighting so hard to keep control of the European project, because they know that the decline of the European project will also mean the decline of German power in Europe as well, which is why Merkel is fighting so hard to keep this all together. But I do believe Brexit it's good for Britain, it's good for Europe, it's also good for the United States. And when freedom is on the rise, when sovereignty and self-determination is on the rise, that's great for the whole of Europe.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have a question on the European refugee crisis? Okay, sir? Yep, go ahead. Stand up, shout it out.
Hi, my name is Mark Maruga. I'm a student from Stony Brook University, and as a conservative and an American Muslim, I have a question. Sorry, I'm a bit nervous.
It's okay.
Do you feel that the economic policies in Europe with a lot of the welfare states is sort of leading to more of like the sort of ghettos you see with like a lot of the migrants there? And along with that, how do you feel, how can Muslims in America and Europe help alleviate the crisis that's going on with the immigration problem?
Okay, did everybody hear that? It's the crisis in Europe and the Muslim immigration into Europe, and basically, how do you deal with it? I'm going to turn that over to you, Zudi.
Sure. Thank you for that question. And I think both are interrelated, which is, if you look at families like ours that escaped for political reasons and came to live in America and in the West for religious freedom and personal independence and to embrace free market principles, I think the nanny state has unfortunately allowed many of them. You'll see some of the most militants, the Hizb ut-Tahrir folks, the Anjem Chowdhuries of Europe, if you will, are getting welfare checks while they're plotting war against Europe. So I think Europe needs to look, and many of these countries need to look at the fact that the nanny state has prevented many of these communities from assimilating, which economic assimilation really ushers in. And I'll let others talk about sort of the economics internally unrelated to Muslim issues. More importantly is what should Muslim immigrants do in Muslim communities. I think we need to step away from this denial, from the blind victim complex that most of the Muslim organizations that speak on behalf of our communities are so obsessed with exaggerating so-called, what they call Islamophobia, a term that I reject, which is actually they're talking about bigotry against Muslims. They exaggerate it, ignoring the numbers that actually acts of anti-Semitism against Jewish communities are still 2 to 3 times more than that what's happening against Muslims. But by exaggerating it, they create a siege mentality, and actually it is the first stages in radicalization. If you look at the radicalization pathway of ISIS and other operatives, they start by a sense of alienation, a sense of hating the West, that the West hates us, etc. So Muslims need to start embracing American and European and British and French principles of what it means to be French, what it means to be American or British, and then begin to tell their community that they not only love the country, but love the freedom that that country gives them, rather than as a sense of entitlement. We have something we tell our Muslim Liberty Project kids. We say, are you Americans that happen to be Muslim, or Muslims who demand to be American? Currently, most Muslim organizations, unfortunately, teach our kids that they are Muslims who demand to be French, demand to be German. I'm sorry. It's a privilege to live in freedom, and you need to give back as somebody who just happens to be Muslim.
I think let's get to questions. Okay, in the front row, sir.
So, just kind of start, I'm Greek American. My family immigrated here from Greece back in the 70s, so I keep up a lot with the migrant situation because it affects my family's home big time. Migrant situation there has heavily hurt Greece since we almost had Brexit, which personally I was hoping to see because, in my opinion, I think the union stagnates economies greatly, and all it does is put economies in a cyclical motion. Again, that's what we see with Greece, for example. So, migrant
Okay, did everybody hear that question? This gentleman was a Greek American, and he's been in touch with his family in Greece, and Greece is being overwhelmed by the migrant crisis into Greece. Ben, you've been in the security part of this and seen firsthand. Is there a possibility to have camps in the region where the migrants are coming from and to secure them in Syria, in Iraq, in other parts of that world?
Well, I think there's two answers. It's a two-part answer to that. So can they build the camps? You know, they certainly can. But I mean, at least I just got back from London as well, and what was on the BBC constantly, they were just closing one of the camps, and I mean they were doing it was a very liberal style media push showing what was going on internally in these camps, and there was actually a moderately funny video. Maybe it's just my poor sense of humor, but it was Jude Law, the actor, who had gone into this camp to bring awareness, and he essentially got mugged and mauled, and they were throwing stuff at him. So can they build camps? My concern, and this ties, and I apologize, I know a little bit less about Greece than I probably should, but my concern is when the migrants and look, a lot of them have I mean they're real refugees. I mean trying to find a better place and a safe place. However, it's my fear is when they start getting integrated into the population there, like what we saw in Paris, you know, and in Paris and these places of severe, you know, these poor neighborhoods, right? I know I'll get in trouble if I say no-go zone, so I'm not going to say no-go zone. However, the arrondissement that was in Paris, I mean, that was a very poor area, and I'll tell you, you know, if you look at the way that these terror organizations, and they operate in cellular structures, they use these logistics tools, right? They use citizens that are there that have French passports or have Greek passports, and they can move, you know, through the system. And I think my big, you know, one, I think the intelligence agencies here in the United States really need to start working very closely with Europe in ways that we just really haven't yet. Number two, our own borders. I mean, if you've seen, you know, the San Bernardino, when she came over, the questions that they asked her, you know, do you intend on effecting a terrorist attack in this country? You know, crazy. And so if we can do that, because I tell you, my biggest fear, if you look at what happened in Paris, they utilized TATP, which is a type of explosive that you can literally buy at Walmart, Kmart, and Home Depot. It takes you about an hour in a bathtub, and you can make it. And if you don't know how to make it, it's on YouTube. It takes about 5 minutes for you to learn. And they were able to spend about $200, build these suicide vests that all worked, by the way, exactly as they were designed. My overarching concern is the fact that obviously people in Europe, you know, with a French or other European passports can come to this country with essentially without a visa, can come in for, you know, 30, 60 days on a tourist visa. That is where I start to get concerned, and so I think it is very, sometimes in the national security domain, I start thinking, well, how can we fix Syria and how can we start fixing Greece? My first concern has to be, how do we secure this country? And that is certainly part of it, but to me, I think we have to really start engaging our border controls, and we have to have the intelligence community start to work.
Okay, another question over here, sir. The white beard, go up. Yep, that's you. Stand up, ask a question, shout it out.
Okay, I can see the conundrum of having a NATO where when you invite somebody into NATO, you want them to join the West. However, you've got to convince yourself that you're willing to support that country. And I think in the Baltics, we're kind of looking at that. Is it worth defending these things when a crisis arises? So I can see that. But I'd like especially my European participants here to question whether there's an EU or not. What difference is that going to make in terms of the commitment of European countries, whether they devolve back into their original political boundaries or whether they remain an EU? Can the NATO function without these European nations making a greater commitment to NATO and doing their part to make sure that that's an effective organization?
Okay, so I think that the other question I would add to that is, why do we care? If they're not willing to do it, why should we do it for them?
Yeah, again, an excellent question. And just very briefly, I do think, you know, Greece needs to leave the European single currency, leave the European Union as well, and become a free country again. Because, you know, you cannot be. It's not acceptable to be ruled by Brussels, and, you know, you need to reassert your sovereignty. With regard to the NATO question, excellent question. I believe that if the European project crumbles, NATO will become stronger frankly. And you know, a lot of the thinking behind this creation of a European superstate is to act as a sort of counterweight against the United States, the transatlantic alliance, and also NATO. In fact, the EU, in many ways, undermines NATO. And I think that the NATO alliance would be a lot stronger if the European project wasn't there. But you can be sure, you know, that our enemies, you know, they don't fear the European Union, but they do fear and respect the NATO alliance, which is a real working alliance. And it's not a supranational entity. I mean, NATO, for all its faults and problems, does overall still work. It's our best guarantee of security. The European Union doesn't guarantee anyone's security, as we saw with the Paris attacks.
I think we have time for one really quick question. And the man at the back who's just standing up and jumping up and down. Yep, that's you.
My name's Charlie Dunn from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm a businessman, and for the life of me, I cannot understand, even though I hear it's political correctness, why our government, even in Europe and our government in the U.S., will not call it radical Islam. Why are we being told what we're being told? Where are the leaders in our country, like the military leaders, the generals? Why aren't people standing up and calling this out?
Okay, can I take the prerogative of the chair and answer that one? Political correctness is going to get us all killed. And why are our leaders not stepping up and you know, who knows? You know, it's time to mow. That's why you're here at CPAC. You're here to mow the lawn.
They grew
Can
up
I-
in fantasy land.
Well, but I think that the exciting thing about all that is that's why you're here at CPAC. You're here to realize that it's time to mow the lawn, that if you've got a government that's not responsive to you today, go elect new leaders. Just like Ronald Reagan came here in 1980, and he said the establishment isn't doing what it's supposed to do, whether it's the Republican establishment or the Democrats. So let's change everything. Let's have a Reagan revolution. It's time to mow the lawn. And I think the rest of us agree it's time to mow the lawn again. Okay, with that, thank you very much. I know a lot of people have questions, and I'm going to offer up these three fellows if you want to nab them on the way out. I'm sure they'll be happy to answer your questions.